and welcome to another episode of Your Life, Your Way. I'm your host, Kathleen McDermott. Today's episode is a guest interview. Grief. When you hear the word grief, or you think about grief, things you've grieved, where does your mind go first? I think typically where the mind goes is to a loss of someone via death. I think that's a natural thought process. But there's so many things, so many other things that we grieve. Whether we grieve loss of friendships, loss of dreams, loss of how we thought life was going to be and it's not. So we're going to talk about that today. And I really do think that this is something that we do need to bring to the forefront. There's so many things as humans that we feel we really can't talk about. And I think also there's that thought process of, well, there should be X amount of time you grieve and then you're good to go. Well, that's not the case. And we are all so different. And depending on what we are grieving, of course, it's going to have its own process. So however you think about grief, if it's something that you haven't really given much thought to, or if you have been grieving something of your own and, you're kind of keeping it to yourself, find someone at least to talk with about it and listen in today. And hopefully this is a topic that we can continue to talk about. My guest is Lynne Thompson. She is the host of the Storied Human podcast. And, we all tend to think that, we don't have stories to tell. We don't have interesting stories to tell, but we do. People do. And she has a wonderful podcast, people sharing their insights to life and their experiences and their stories. And it's very interesting. So we are going to talk about grief and regret. Lynne has personal experience in this area, and she has done also quite a bit of research into these areas. So let's dig into the conversation. Thank you so much for being here, and here we go. Hello, Lynne Thompson. I'm so happy to have you here with me today. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Kathleen, it's so great to be back with you. I'm so pleased to be here and I'm ready to talk.
We do have fun conversations, don't we?
We do.
I love your podcast. I love the theme of your podcast, and I do want you to tell us about it. I especially love the theme of your podcast. It's called The Storied Human. And we have so many stories, and it really touches me because we tell ourselves so many stories through our life that aren't even true. God knows I'm guilty. I've done it myself so many times. I probably still do to a certain extent, even with all the work that I've done. Work never ends, which is a beautiful thing. But What we you and I really want to talk about today and share and to serve in is grief. And the stories that we tell ourselves tie so into, even though there are stories that I've told myself that I've let go of, I've had to grieve some of those stories because I believed them for so long. So we're going to talk a lot today about grief and the directions that it comes from. We often think of grief and immediately go to death, which is probably the most traumatic grief that we do experience. But we do have grief that comes from other sources, some smaller, some bigger, some tiny, but it's still grief, and how we process it or don't process is very important. So I would love if you would begin by telling us a bit about your podcast, what it's about, and how it touches you and how it's meant to serve others.
Well, thank you. It's all about stories. And the more I started looking at that, why I was drawn to that is I've always loved stories and hearing people's stories. But even more, I like that deeper sort of psychological thing you touched on, is that sometimes we're holding stories about ourselves that are no longer serving us. And I like to look at that too. Like, what are you telling yourself that's probably not true? Or maybe you should ask yourself, where did I hear that first? Because we pick up things from our family when we're young and we just take them in, things that are said about us, or we play as children, we're little sponges. We pay close attention to what's said about others. We store it all and we have no discernment when we're little. And some of the memories that come up and the stories that we're telling ourselves, if we take a look, we reinterpret them as adults and say, well, maybe that wasn't so true, or maybe that wasn't so good. And we just redefine whether that story means anything for us. So I like to hear people's stories about how they work through struggles and how they transformed. I love that. That's my favorite thing.
Mhm.
But I also like to hear about how people grow and redefine themselves through their stories they tell themselves. And there's even like a section of psychology called narrative psychology, and it's relatively new. And part of it is people telling stories about themselves, like what they believe to be true. It's fascinating, and people have told stories for thousands of years. I'm a writer, but oral stories are so old, and I'm just love that, how long we've been telling each other stories. And some of the research I did said, why stories, right? We told each other stories because we remembered that better than just telling somebody a warning or telling somebody a fact. If we tell a story, if we construct a narrative, then we walk away remembering it. And the example was hysterical, that they said back in the caveman days, if you told someone, don't go around that cave, there's something bad there. That doesn't work the same as my cousin walked around that cave and got attacked by a tiger, and he was, really injured. So there's a story to it that makes it, your brain works that way. Your brain organizes things in that way.
It also makes
So
us more relatable, don't you think?
I just got it in deep. Yes. Really important. Right. And yes, that's how people connect. That's how people connect, is through stories. So
Wonderful.
yeah, I'm obsessed.
I love the introduction. I love your podcast, and definitely, folks, take a listen, check it out. Storied Human. So we are going to talk about grief. And as I said, grief comes from all different directions. And you have such a take on your personal experiences. And this comes back to stories. Grief can come from friendships ending. It can come from losing your community. I know when I lived in upstate New York my entire life. And at 61 years of age, I packed up and left everything I ever knew. And there was a grieving process to that. It took me a while to realize it. But when I did realize that, I needed to go through that process. So because I lost a community that I grew up with.
That's big. Yeah.
It is. And even though it's a beautiful thing and I wouldn't trade it, I didn't recognize it right away. So I'd love to touch on the recognizing of grief and different things as well. Losing that vision of how we see our lives to be. I've gone through a divorce, and probably one of the greatest things I've ever grieved, because of what it was, but also it's that vision you have of your life. So there's a lot of grief and loss around that. And just, I think one of the biggest things that it comes back to your stories and releasing the stories, we grieve those as well. So and I know you have an interesting story to tell about the brain and grief. So I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about your take on grief, maybe a story of your own or two, and give us your thoughts.
It's funny, I keep coming back to grief. And when I first found myself drawn to it, I was like, why am I drawn to this sad thing? But it's really that it's universal. Everyone has to go through it. And as you wisely point out, we go through it in different ways, not just when we lose someone. I mean, I just was sharing before we started recording that I was forced to leave a job I really loved. And there's a grieving there. I loved everyone on that team. They loved me. It was like a love fest. And we don't maybe give it its due. We sort of, I think that there's almost a male model of being tough, and you can move anywhere, and you can change jobs, and you're in charge, and you arrange your own life, and you do everything. And so that's great. It's good to be in charge of your life, but especially if you're a sensitive person, you're going to feel that when you lose things, and you're going to feel maybe in this society, like you shouldn't feel that way, like, oh, well, it's just a job, or, oh, I just moved, I'll be fine. But there's always that component of loss in our life on different levels, right? So
Agreed.
Basically life is about loss and love. Basically, that's what I came down to.
They go hand in hand.
And there you are. And it's always intermingled. I remember talking to some moms. I'm in a mom's group, We've been together for like 27 years, believe it or not. We
Hmm.
started on the early internet, and all our kids are like 26 now. We started when we were pregnant. We were all due in March of 1996. It worked out great. And it was unusual because I tried to join the same group for my younger child, and it didn't gel. So there's just something about these women. And I remember sharing with them my sadness over my kids no longer being little, or I miss when they were little.
Yes.
And I realized that grief was woven into the experience of being a mom. Not that you don't love each stage, not that you're not proud of them, but I thought about it. The baby does not grow into a bigger baby. The baby goes away and becomes a toddler. And the toddler goes away and becomes a preschooler, and on and on. So you're grieving a little bit each stage. It is grief, it's loss.
And then you get hit with empty nest.
And then you get hit with empty nest. I was thinking we should do like a whole podcast about that. That hit me really hard. And I think people who are sensitive to things, I'm sensitive to stuff, get hit harder. I wrote an article for Medium called "You Have to Fill the Empty Nest." And I really am, desperately trying to do that. Although I still have somebody at home. So we'll see if it really works when he leaves. But there's a grieving, it's like a thread of grief that runs through motherhood that we don't talk about. And whenever I would bring it up, other mothers would shush me, not in a bad way, just to try to be positive, right? They would say, "Oh, but they're doing so well, and I'm so happy for them." No, you're not just happy. You miss your children, and you're the only one that remembers. They don't remember being a baby, but you do, and how you cherish them. And so you carry that forward. And I think that's the flip side is when people start dying that remember you as a child, have memories about you, those memories leave with them. So it's very tangled up.
I never thought about that.
I just recently thought about that myself because my dad died a year ago. And I said, okay, both my parents are gone and my aunts and uncles are gone. So who carries these stories forward about me? Who remember, because as mothers, we do that, right? We cherish these stories. We save things from our children. I still have bags of little clothes that they mean so much to you, right? You hold them and you get kind of misty eyed, and I'm
trying hard not to cry now.
and I try hard, right? I say, no, don't get carried away. But we hold these stories and memories about our children, and we hold them dear. We keep them warm for them almost. And when they remind us of something, we tell them, "Oh, you were always like that," or "Remember when your sister did this?" Those things are really treasures. And when someone dies, they take those with them. And the most wonderful thing happened to me. I was out to dinner with my cousin because she's like the last one, in my family. And she told this story just off the top of her head. She's like 5 years older than me. And she said, "Oh, we went out to Easter at that restaurant where they had the Pennsylvania Dutch food. And both the grandmas came, your grandma Leister and your grandma Mumbauer. Grandma Mumbauer had that compression sleeve on her leg. She was always saying her leg was swollen. And grandma Leister, she was this tiny, energetic thing. And she was just having so much fun. And you were tiny." She goes, "Maybe you were like 3 or 4. And she just talked about this dinner, and I clung to every word. And that's, it emphasized for me that not many people carry those memories of me.
I never thought about that.
So I think it's a good idea to write them down. My mother did write some things down in her journal as she neared the end of her life. And it's a good idea to videotape your older relatives. There are things I wish I could ask them, So the loss is real, and part of the loss is pieces of you, literally. It's kind of like a complicated thing.
I'm going to be honest. I'm writing down and making a note because you just touched on so much there, and I want to make sure I have it so I can do something about it.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's like the number one goal, I think, of our podcasts, because I love your podcast. I learned so much from you, is that we tell our stories or we present our guests and people can learn. That's what we hope, right? If you've been through
Yes.
something, what's the point unless you can help
If we can help
somebody?
one person, if we
I
can help
know.
one person.
And then you feel better, then you feel
Mhm.
better. So yeah, I got off on a tangent there, but I've been really thinking about it because I lost my dad. And there are things, I wish I could ask him.
How do you think you have walked yourself through? How do you think because I know sometimes there are stages of grief. We know that.
Right.
And we can fight, we can deny, we can ignore, we can, ignore it, hope it goes away, but it doesn't. So how do you yourself find that you move through grief? Have you fought it? Have you accepted it? How has the process been for you when, you've lost both your parents?
That's a great question. Well, the loss of my mother was so shocking, and I was only 43 and I had little kids. So that was much more difficult. I share on my podcast that I did not handle it well. And I try to give people advice about how to handle it better than I did. I'm a leave me alone person. I'm going to go in my tower and I'm going to be miserable and stay away from me. I'm an isolationist. And that's like the last thing you want to do, even though it feels natural. And my husband gave into that and would take the kids and say, oh, mom needs her time. It was looking back on it. And I also attended a webinar on your brain on grief. And she sort of validated, the psychologist that ran it, she sort of validated that you have to push yourself a little to participate in social things, even if you don't feel like it at all, even if you're not going to be at your best, so that's one of the things that I would say I learned. But losing my father was not as difficult because he was almost 89. So he had a nice long life and he had dementia. So if he hadn't passed away when he did, they were considering putting him in a memory care. He lived with my stepmother, a memory care facility, and he would have hated that. So for me, letting him go, it was like he slipped away and it was easier, much easier. It felt more natural. So different passings will hit you differently. And one of the things they mentioned in the webinar is that grief does not go away. It comes back, in different forms and different waves. Something will, maybe years later will touch off. Like she said, an event can really do it. Like if you're at a wedding and those people aren't there, or somebody has a baby and those people can't see the baby, you just, it's being human. It's feeling you're missing that person, and that's normal. So what do I do now? I continue being social. I push myself to be social, even if I'm really sad. Like Christmas was hard this year. It was the first Christmas without my dad. I noticed I just wasn't myself. I wasn't enthusiastic about it. I was dragging myself around, but I just kept going and I did all the things we do so that I could reach that I could still make Christmas for my family and I could feel more normal, even though I wasn't normal. And it's okay not to be normal. I think we have this crazy idea that you're supposed to just feel better really fast or something.
Well, and I was thinking when you were saying that, and it's true, because we are really taught to poo-poo our feelings, to push them aside. They're not, just move on. And our feelings are important. Our feelings, we really want to embrace your feelings and honor how you are feeling at that moment. And so much can be learned from what we are feeling. And if you take the time to be aware and to be sensitive to them and to just honor them, it's okay to honor your feelings. And that word normal really just sends me, that's a whole other podcast. Because, what is normal, but someone's perception.
That's a really good point.
So
you have to
feelings.
You have to feel your feelings. It's so simple, but
Don't get lost in them.
No, but you have to get,
yes.
The only way forward is through them. And I learned that the first time because I was such a mess after my mom and I had nowhere to go with it. They say grief is love with nowhere to go. And that's how I felt. I felt upended and I didn't really know. And I was really worried that I couldn't be there for my kids, so I went to a therapist after a little while because I didn't seem to be getting better. And she talked exactly about what you just said about your feelings aren't going to go away if you stuff them down. And what came about from that was so dramatic because she uncovered that I had always stuffed things down, that's what being a good girl was. You don't show distress. You're always smiling. Come on, smile, and I have resting bitch face. So I was told that all the time.
I'm sure we all have a little bit of that.
So yeah, that was such a simple thing, but it helped me so much because she said, well, why are you afraid to feel your feelings? And I said, and this is what happens when someone very close to you dies. I said, I'm afraid if I start to cry now, I will never stop. I remember saying to my husband, I didn't know you could be this sad and still live. It was a level of sadness I had no idea existed.
I'm familiar with that.
And I was still walking around. Yeah. I mean, and I think we have to honor that and tell people you're not alone. That's really how it can feel. And you have to move through. And if you need help, get help. I tell people on the podcast, it doesn't have to be a therapist. There are free groups, grief groups at hospitals. If you have a good friend who's good at listening, talk to your friend, a pastor, a nurse that you really like, a social worker at the hospital. Just talk to somebody. Don't be alone.
Don't you find, I was just having a similar conversation with someone who I adore yesterday. We struggle to ask for help.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, there's another conditioning right there, another podcast. We
Oh my
struggle,
God.
we refuse, we don't want to ask for help. We can do it ourselves. And the problem and the challenge and the result is if we get ourselves too deep into that darkness, it is very difficult to find your way out on your own.
It is by yourself.
And that
I got to
is
mention that's a
not
trauma
good.
response at times.
Yeah.
I don't need anyone. I'll be fine. I'll do it myself. And not that I've had a lot of trauma in my life, but I did come from a codependent alcoholic family. And I was the oldest child. And so one of the things that comes out of codependency is to be hyper responsible. You're either the fuck up or you're sorry for my French, or you're hyper responsible. And I was the hyper responsible one. So I understood that my role was to never need anyone, to always be competent and in charge. And of course, that's impossible. And a lot of women take that on for whatever reason. It's not always connected to trauma, but being a perfectionist, always in charge, always, my God, have we thought about what that means, pursuing perfection? Like
it doesn't exist.
Who's perfect? God is perfect. That's about it, right? So you can't be God or source or creator or, the universe. You can't be that. And so what a waste of our time, right? Trying to be perfect.
Again, it's like someone's perception.
And I love that idea that you said, don't be afraid to ask for help. Well, my mother was a therapist, so I had that good model, and I have sought therapy short term when I need it. I feel like it's a normal thing. And so when I went to the therapist, we uncovered that I had complicated grief, which is also called long-term grief. And it's kind of like a stew of depression and grief. And you can tell you have it if you're not getting better. You're supposed to get gradually better. I mean, it might take a while, but you're on an upward direction with your grief. It's a little easier to carry, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't getting better for me. And I felt stuck. And she taught me that very simple lesson that you have to move through your feelings and they will lessen. You will get through them. I think that's we avoid it because we don't want to go there. We're like, what if I never get better or if I'm sad forever? Because that's how it feels. But you have to remind yourself that this too shall pass. It's really true. You have to tell yourself, and you have to say, like I saw it as a tunnel, the way she was describing it. I saw it as a tunnel and I had to get through the tunnel. And I didn't want to go through the tunnel. But she encouraged me to do that. And she said, that's how you do it. You got to do it. And one of the things that happened was I got home and my son hugged me and I didn't let go of the hug first. It was just like, that's sort of what started to happen to me from the therapy was I let him break the hug. And I had read that somewhere, but I wasn't really able to put it into practice. And the reason you do that is children are not on a schedule and they're not thinking of the next thing they have to do, or what's an appropriate time to break a hug. They're just hugging you because they love you and they need to hug you. So I was shocked how long they held the hug. When I let them break the hug, they always hugged longer than I would, because I was always like the next, oh, I got to clean the kitchen or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
All those dumb things that we think about. So right away, I got more connected with them. And then another thing they benefited from this therapy was when they cried, I used to shush them, not in a mean way, but just like, oh, you'll be okay. It's okay. You can stop crying. And I would hold them, and I was very sympathetic, but I was probably uncomfortable on some level with too much crying,
Mm-hmm.
and this was a shift for me from this therapy. When they cried, I just said, it's okay to cry. And I would hold their hand and I would hug them and hold them. They always cried a little longer than I was comfortable with. Right. But that was their feelings. I began to teach them what I had learned. Like, it's okay to cry and you can cry it out. And it's a small shift, but it was really helpful. And I was so grateful to the therapist.
And that just jazzes me totally, because in your growth, in your expansion, in your healing, it allowed you to see and offer that same healing and expansion and freedom to your children.
I was just so grateful. Yeah. And she was
Breaking the
so,
cycle.
the therapist was so special. She was just perfect for me at the time. She was very soft-spoken. She was very gentle. She was someone you could trust your feelings with. So it's important to find somebody that you resonate with, somebody, and you have to forgive your friends. They don't all understand.
No, and I was blessed
Yeah.
and I'm still blessed, because my best friend, she's been there for me. She was there for me in my darkest times and my toughest times. And she's still here to call me on my poop, which she doesn't hesitate to do. And I give her that same love in return.
That's so good.
It can be hard to find that special person, but sometimes the reason we don't find that person is we don't allow ourselves to.
That's true.
And why do any one of us who are in that feeling, we wouldn't hesitate to offer support and help to someone else. So my question is, then why do we want to deprive someone else of feeling that joy of being kind and supportive and helpful to someone? It's a beautiful thing. It's part of community that we really need to feed more and to love more and to bring back into our lives. We need to have that community of support and allowing each other to help each other out. It's really kind of the basic nature of, law of nature is for us to be there and walk this path together
and be human together and learn from each other. And that's why also groups with different ages is so important. It's important to be with different aged people, because I remember someone saying to me, I was at a funeral and one of my friends said, see, the older people know how to do this. They know how to do this. They know how to move through these rituals. They know how to give support. They know that you need meals the next day. They know that you need an ear. They know to be quiet and just be with you. Like, they've been through it.
So it's going to say we've been through our own stuff.
It's really good to have different ages so we can learn from each other. I remember being not there for somebody when I was like in my 20s and her father died. I just didn't have a clue, and I feel bad about that. I didn't know.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, you're right. We don't know what we don't know. And my father used to say to me, ask me, why do you want to learn the hard way? He says, because I want to learn the lesson myself. And in supporting someone else, I don't want to take it away from them, their experience away from them. I just want to hold a safe space for them so that they can move through it and learn their own lessons. Because if any of us try to poo or hush or, it's okay, if we try to lessen it, it doesn't help them move through. So there's a difference in being, holding that safe space and rather trying to rush them through it, I think is the point I'm trying to make.
Or trying to control it. Like what you're talking about is you take your ego out of it. And that's a beautiful thing. You're not attached to the outcome.
No.
You're not attached to how fast it happens. Mm-hmm. You want space for that person to grow in the way they need to.
Exactly. And they
And
need
so,
to experience it. They need to go through, no matter
exactly.
how painful it is, you still need to go through it for your own personal experience and growth.
And I'd like to talk about the gifts that come from going through something like
Please.
this. I just am much more compassionate. The last like 20 years, I've been so much more compassionate and understanding. And, you know, there's a depth to how I connect with people. There's so many things to be grateful, the gifts that came from the grief, going through grief, the process. It's a growth. You know, the closer you are to the person, the harder it is in many ways. I also sometimes I talk to people about guilty grief, you know, different kinds of grief when your relationship is not good with a parent or a friend, and they die, and now you can never make it better. And you wish you're grieving what could have been, you know, the relationship that you didn't have.
Yeah.
And so that's all difficult too. I mean, there's just so many pieces to grief.
What are some other benefits that you found that you gained?
I just know how to be there for people who are grieving. It's such a gift. I reach out to people, I can be with their sadness, and I feel so good that I'm able to turn it around, you know, what I went through, and offer and tell people how to do that too. Like, that's one of the things I do talk about a little bit on the podcast is what can you do for someone who's grieving? And it's the simplest thing in the world. Just be there for them, sit with them, hear them.
Oh, that's a biggie. Here, don't just
let
listen,
them know. Just be quiet. It's okay to be quiet. And then say, if you're close to them, say, is there anything you need? Can I get anything for you? Because sometimes it's the small things that make people feel better. One of my good friends came over the next day with a big plate of sandwiches. She didn't ask. She just came over with this giant plate of sandwiches. My stepmother was up from Georgia. My father was there. My kids were there. I mean, I desperately needed something like that, you know, and I didn't even think about it. You don't think about running your life when, you know, when you're going through all that preparation, and we were sifting through pictures for the service. So if you have that place in someone's life where you're close enough to say, can I grocery shop for you? Do you need lunch tomorrow? It's really a wonderful way to just support someone in a very concrete way. And that shows how much you love them and support them. So it's not just being there for them, but doing those things. Like, don't be afraid to I just love my friend that she did that. She just said, hey, here's some sandwiches. You know, it was just so perfect.
Beautiful. And it's important to recognize and everything that you're saying and the different experiences of grief, even though it doesn't matter what you're going through. If you're going through the loss of a parent, if you're going through a divorce, if you're going through the loss of whatever it happens to be, could be a pregnancy loss, even though there are millions of other people that have gone through what you're going through, it's your experience. It's not every single person's experience is their own. It's different.
It's a path that's only yours, right?
Exactly. And to support someone within that, you can't say, well, this is how it is, and that's how it is because that was my experience.
Yeah.
Which is another reason why they have to walk through themselves, because it's just theirs.
That's a really good, excellent point. Yeah, because I had people saying, you know, people say these tried and true things to you sometimes, like, it takes a year. You need to go through each season and then you'll be better. And I was like, well, I hate to tell you this, but it didn't get better after a year, maybe a little better. For me, it took 2 years to feel normal. There it is. I said it.
You said that word.
A long time, right? I know, normal. I'm sorry. 2 years to feel a little bit back to myself. Did I function during that time? Yeah. Did I take care of my kids during that time? Yeah. But I wasn't myself inside. And again, it's unique, like you said. And somebody else said, I remember one of my husband's friends said, but hasn't it been 6 weeks? Because I didn't come to something that he was going to. She's like, but it's been 6 weeks. It's like, it was my mom, you know, it's like, lost my mom.
Yeah. Which leads me to say, and to remind people that please stop worrying what other people think. When someone's responding with things like that, they don't mean it to be harsh. They don't mean it to be, it's just they're coming from their own life experiences.
They don't know.
They don't know. And that's where the compassion comes in. When you've gone through this stuff and you've come out the other side, you do have more compassion, because now you can say, I understand why they're reacting and responding the way that they are.
Totally.
So I understand. I don't need to judge them.
And they can't go there with you because they don't
No,
understand.
exactly.
And it's, you know, would you judge a little child for not knowing something? No, right? We're all on a different, maybe they know something about something I've never been through. Like, it's just totally
Exactly.
random. Yeah.
So I think that also stops us from asking for help. So please, please stop worrying what other things. Just find, as Lynn said in the very beginning, as you said, Lynn, that find the right person for you, find the right place for you to get the help and support that serves you. Because this is your journey, no one else's.
It's
Don't
true.
be afraid to ask for help, because you're worth it.
Oh,
You're not alone. And there's a whole lot of love out there for you.
and it is really helpful to be with other people who are going through the same thing. It can be very healing.
Yes. Is there anything else you would like to share? I would love to have you share how people can reach out to you to have more of a conversation, to hear your podcast. I will include the information in the show notes, but if you could just give a shout out for yourself now.
Thank you. I have a Facebook group called The Storied Human. So we talk on that, and I share, you know, extra stuff that I find about stories. And I also put up my promos for my podcast. My podcast is The Storied Human, THE, Storied Human. And it is on everywhere you find your podcasts. And I do have an Instagram. I'm not super active, but I do put stuff on there, and I can be DM'd on there. And that's capital L Thompson _574. I didn't change it because I've had it for so long. And I have an email called thestoriedhuman@gmail.com. You can reach me that way. And on Linktree too. I have a Linktree /storiedhuman. All my links are on there. And I would love to hear anybody's stories or answer questions or have a chat. Whatever you feel like doing, it would be great. Thanks for this time. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. I'm sure there'll be more conversations, because we always have so much fun. We really get into some deep things, which I do love and enjoy as well. So thank you for the gift of you and everything that you've shared. And I hope, like, as I said in the beginning, if we can just touch one person, then that jazzes both.
Then our work is done.
Yes,
At least for today. Thank you so much, Kathleen.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. And blessings to you for the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Grief. I took away a couple of things today. I hope you did too. For me, I think the number one point was, as my sons were going from one stage to the next and growing, I never applied the word grief to missing those previous ages and memories and all the joy and fun. So I didn't look at it that way. But I suppose there's so much that we don't want to put that particular label on. We want to stuff down our feelings, as we discussed in the podcast. So honor your feelings, honor the process, whatever you're going through, honor yourself, how you need to move through it. It's yours. And no matter how many other people are going through the exact same thing or have gone or will go, this is yours. And it's important to honor you in that process. If it's becoming too much for you, please don't hesitate to reach out and find help, accept support, accept help. You do not have to go through this alone. None of us have to go through things alone if we're really willing to reach out and ask. You may want to talk with Lynne some more. I will have her Linktree information in the show notes. And please do check out her The Storied Human. You can find her on Spotify, Apple. And if you would like to continue the conversation about grief, if there's anything in particular that you'd like to see me focus on another episode, whether it be solo or interview, please reach out to me, kmyourlifeyourway@gmail.com, kmyourlifeyourway@gmail.com, and let me know if there's a topic or an area that you'd like to expand more on. I'm so glad and honored and happy to have you as part of the Your Life, Your Way community. Thank you for being here. I wish you so much peace in your life and many blessings. Namaste.